Reuben Sachs, A Sketch by Amy Levy. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Reuben Sachs by Amy Levy, read by Adrian Pretzelis. Chapter 7. On this day shall he make an atonement for you, to purify you. You shall be clean from all your sins. Leviticus 16:30. Herbert, or as he was generally spoken of, Bertie Lee Harrison, called at Lancaster Gate on the day of the New Year to make acquaintance with Reuben's people and offer his best wishes for the year 5640. He was a small, fair, fluent person, very carefully dressed, assiduously polite, and bearing on his amiable, commonplace, neatly modelled little face no traces of the spiritual conflict which anyone knowing his history might have supposed him to have passed through. Esther, who happened to be calling on her aunt at the time of Bertie's visit, classified him at once as an intelligent fool. But Adelaide professed herself delighted with the little man, and had had the joy of informing him that she had once met his sister, Lady Chemmis, at a garden party. Lady Chemmis is charming, Reuben said when the matter was being discussed. Sir Nicholas, too, is a good fellow. They have a place some miles out of St. Baldwin's. His mind ran a good deal on St. Baldwin's in these days, and on Paul Ronaldson, its Conservative member, lying hopelessly ill in Grosvenor Place. Reuben, it may be added, was true to the traditions of his race and wore the primrose, while Leo, who knew nothing about politics, gave himself out as a social democrat. Mr. Lee Harrison was to break his fast in Portland Place on the evening of the Day of Atonement, when it was old Solomon's custom to assemble his family round him in great numbers. Adelaide objected to this arrangement. "It will give him such a bad impression," she said. "He asked for local colour, and local colour he shall have," answered Reuben, amused. "It is disloyal to your own people to assume such an attitude regarding them to a stranger. After all, he is not one of us," cried Adelaide, taking a high tone. "Your accusations are a little vague, Addy, but to tell you the truth, I had no choice in the matter. I took him up yesterday to Portland Place, and the old man gave him the invitation. He simply jumped at it." "Those dreadful Samuel Saxes!" groaned Adelaide. "Oh, they are a remarkable survival. You should learn to take them in the right spirit," answered her brother. He was dining that night at the house of an important Conservative MP, and was disposed to take a cheerful view of things. The fast day, or Day of Atonement, is the greatest national occasion of the whole year. Even those lax Jews who practise their callings on Saturdays and other religious holidays are withheld by public opinion on either side the tribal barrier from doing so on this day of days. The synagogues are thronged, and if the number of people who rigidly adhere to total abstinence from food for 24 hours is rapidly diminishing, there are still many to be found who continue to do so. Solomon Sachs, his daughter Rebecca, and the Montague Cohens worshipped in the Bayswater Synagogue. The rest of the family had seats in the Reformed Synagogue in Upper Berkeley Street, an arrangement to which the old man was too liberal-minded to take objection. The Quijano family attended the synagogue of the Spanish and Portuguese Jews in Bryanston Street, with the exception of Judith, who shared with her cousins the simplified service, the beautiful music, and other innovations of Upper Berkeley Street. The morning of the particular Day of Atonement of which I write dawned bright and clear, and from an early hour in all quarters of the town the chosen people, a breakfastless band, might have been seen making their way to the synagogues. Many of the women were in white, which is considered appropriate wear for the occasion, and if traces of depression were discernible on many faces, in view of the long day before them, it is scarcely to be wondered at. It was about 10 o'clock when the Lunningers, who had all breakfasted, made their way into the great hall of the synagogue in Upper Berkeley Street, where the people were streaming in great numbers. As they paused a moment at the bottom of the staircase leading to the ladies' gallery for their party to divide according to sex, Reuben came up to them with Bertie Lee Harrison in his wake. There was a general hand-shaking, and Reuben, as he pressed her fingers, smiled a half-humorous, half-rueful smile at Judith, a protest against the rigours and langueur of the day which lay before them. She managed to say to him over her shoulder, "How is Mr. Ronaldson? He has taken a turn for the better." They laughed in one another's faces. Bertie, struck by the effect of that sudden rapidly checked wave of mirth passing over the beautiful serious face, remarked to Reuben as they turned towards the entrance to their part of the building that the Jewish ladies were certainly very lovely. Reuben said nothing. They were by this time well within the synagogue, but he glanced quickly and coldly under his eyelids at Bertie picking his way jauntily to his seat. Ernest Lullinger, who was very devout, and who loved the exercise of his religion even more than the game of solitaire, had already enwound himself in his tallit, exchanged his tall hat for an embroidered cap, and was muttering his prayers in Hebrew below his breath. Leo, his small, slight, picturesque figure swathed carelessly in the long white garment, with the fringes and the border of blue, his hat tilted over his eyes, leaned against a porphyry column, lost to everything but the glorious music which rolled out from the great organ. He had come to-day under protest, to prevent a definite break with his father, who exacted attendance at synagogue on no other day of the year. The time was yet to come when he should acknowledge to himself the depth of tribal feeling, of love of his race, which lay at the root of his nature. At present he was aware of nothing but revolt against, and almost hatred of, a people who, as far as he could see, lived without ideals, and was given up body and soul to the pursuit of material advantage. Behind him his two little brothers were quarrelling for possession of a prayer-book. Near him stood his father, swaying from side to side, and mumbling his prayers in the corrupt German Hebrew of his youth, a jargon not recognized by the modern culture of Upper Berkeley Street. Reuben and his friends had seats opposite, seats, moreover, which commanded a good view of the ladies of the Lullinger household in the gallery above. Mrs. Lullinger, in a rich lace shawl, very much crumpled, and a new bonnet hopelessly askew. Rose in a tight-fitting costume of white, with blue ribbons. Judith in white also, her dusky hair, the clear soft oval of her face surmounted by a flippant French bonnet, the very latest fashion. It was a long day, growing less and less endurable as it went on, the atmosphere getting thicker and hotter and sickly with the smell of stale perfume. The people, for the most part, stuck to their posts throughout. A few disappeared boldly about lunch-time, returning within an hour refreshed and cheerful. Some, these were chiefly men, fidgeted in and out of the building to the disturbance of their neighbours. One or two ladies fainted. One or two others gossiped audibly from morning till evening, but on the whole decorum was admirably maintained. Judith Quijano went through her devotions upheld by that sense of fitness, of obedience to law and order, which characterized her in every action. It cannot be said that her religion had any strong hold over her. She accepted it unthinkingly. These prayers, read so diligently, in a language of which her knowledge was exceedingly imperfect, these reiterated praises of an austere tribal deity, these expressions of a hope whose consummation was neither desired nor expected, what connection could they have with the personal needs of the human longings of this touchingly ignorant and limited creature? Now and then, when she lifted her eyes, she saw the bored, resigned face of Reuben opposite, and the respectful, attentive countenance of Mr. Lee Harrison, who was going through the day's proceedings with all the zeal of a convert. Leo had absented himself early in the day, and was wandering about the streets in one of those intolerable fits of restless misery which sometimes laid their hold on him. Esther was not in synagogue. She had a sharp wrangle with her mother the night before, which ended in her staying in bed with "Goodbye, sweetheart," for company. She, poor soul, was of those who deny utterly the existence of the friend of whom she stood so sorely in need. Chapter 8. My lord, will't please you to fall to? Richard II. A limp, drab-coloured group was assembled in the drawing-room at Portland Place. It was nearly 7:30, and it only wanted the arrival of the Samuel Saxes, who came from the St. John's Wood Synagogue, for the whole party to descend into the dining-room, where the much-needed meal awaited them. The Lullingers were there, of course, with the exception of Ernest and his mother, who had gone home. The Saxes, the Montague Cohens, Mrs. Cohenthal and Esther, who had left her bed at the 11th hour, prompted by a desire for society, Judith, Mr. and Mrs. Quijano, their son Jack, and 2 young sisters. Bertie Lee Harrison, who had come in with Reuben, pale, exhausted, but prepared to be impressed by everything and every one he saw, confided to his friend that the 24 hours' fast had been the severest ordeal he had yet undergone in the service of religion, his experiences in Asia Minor not excepted. Leo, whose mood had changed, overheard this confidence with an irresistible twitching of the lips. He was sitting on the big sofa with his 2 little brothers, making jokes below his breath to their immense delight, while Rose, at the other end of the same piece of furniture, was maintaining an animated conversation with her cousin Jack. Jack Quijano was a spruce, dapper, polite young man of some 24 or 25 years of age. Perhaps he was a little too spruce, a little too dapper, a little too anxious to put himself en évidence by his assiduity in picking up handkerchiefs and opening doors. But few of his family noticed these defects, least of all Rose, on whom he was beginning to cast aspiring eyes, and whom he closely resembled in personal appearance. The door opened at last, and, to everyone's relief, to admit the expected guests, a party of 6, father, mother, grown-up son and daughter, a little girl, and a little boy. Samuel Sachs was the unsuccessful member of his family. From the beginning the atmosphere of the Stock Exchange had proved too strong for his not very strong brains, and his career had been inaugurated by a series of gambling debts. His father paid his debts and forbade him the office, and he had gone his way for many years, settling down ultimately in a humble way of business as a lithographer. He had married a Polish Jewess, with some money of her own, and in these days old Solomon made him an allowance, so there was enough and to spare in the home in Maida Vale, where he and his family were established. They came now into the crowded drawing-room with a curious mixture of deference and self-assertion. To their eminently provincial minds the Bayswater Saxes, the Lullingers, and the Cohenthals were very great people indeed, and they derived no little prestige in Maida Vale from their connection with so distinguished a family. But as regarded their occasional admittance into the charmed circle, that was a privilege which, though they would on no account have forgone it, was certainly not without its drawbacks. It was splendid, but it was not comfortable. Mrs. Sachs was a stout, dark-haired matron, who entirely overshadowed her shambling, neutral-tinted husband. Netta, the eldest daughter, was a black-haired, richly-coloured, bouncing maiden of 2 or 3 and 20, wearing a white dress with elbow sleeves, cut open a little at the neck, and a great deal of silver jewellery. Alec, her brother, was a short, fair, exuberant-looking youth, with a complexion both glossy and florid, in whom the Saxes' fitness for survival had reasserted itself. He practised painless dentistry with great success in the heart of Maida Vale, and was writing a manual, destined to pass through several editions, on diseases of the teeth and gums. Adele and Bernard, pronounced Adele and Bernard, the 2 children, strutted in behind the others, in all the glory of white cambric and black velveteen respectively, much impressed by the situation, but no less on the defensive than the elder members of their family. There was languid greeting all round, Languor, under the circumstances, was excusable. And then the whole party poured down into the dining-room, where an abundant meal was set out. Old Solomon prided himself on his hospitality, and the great table, which shone with snowy linen, gleaming china, and glittering silver, groaned, as the phrase goes, with good things to eat. There were golden brown blocks of cold fried fish in heavy silver dishes, rosy piles of smoked salmon, saffron-tinted masses of stewed fish, long twisted loaves covered with seeds, innumerable little plates of olives, pickled herrings, and pickled cucumbers, and the quick eyes of Lionel and Sidney had lighted at once on the many-coloured surfaces of the almond puddings which awaited the second course on the sideboard. Aunt Rebecca, faint and yellow behind the silver urns, dispensed tea and coffee with rapid hand, while old Solomon, none the worse for his rigid fast, wielded the fish-slice at the other end of the table. Bertie, respectful, wondering, interested through all his hunger, was seated between Reuben and Mrs. Cohenthal. Adelaide had chosen her seat as far as possible from the Samuel Saxes, whose presence was an offence to her. They, on their part, regarded her with a mixture of respect and dislike. She never gave them more than 2 fingers in her grandfather's house, and ignored them altogether when she met them anywhere else. This conduct impressed them by its magnificence, and they followed the ups and downs of her career, as far as they were able, with a passionate interest that had in it something of the pride of possession. Nor was Adelaide above taking an interest in the affairs of her humbler relatives behind their backs. I cannot help wishing that they had known this. It would have been to them a source of so much innocent gratification. Reuben, who had his cousin Netta on the other side of him, and whose vanity was a far subtler, more complicated affair than his sister's, was making himself agreeable with his accustomed urbanity, beneath which the delighted maiden was unable to detect a lurking irony. The humours of the Samuel Saxes, their appearance, gestures, their excruciating method of pronouncing the English language, the 101 tribal peculiarities which hung to them, had long served their cousins as a favourite family joke into which it would have been difficult for the most observant of outsiders to enter. They were indeed, as Reuben said, a remarkable survival. Born and bred in the very heart of 19th-century London, belonging to an age and a city which has seen the throwing down of so many barriers, the levelling of so many distinctions of class, of caste, of race, of opinion, they had managed to retain the tribal characteristics, to live within the tribal pale to an extent which spoke worlds for the national conservatism. They had been educated at Jewish schools, fed on Jewish food, brought up on Jewish traditions and Jewish prejudice. Their friends, with few exceptions, were of their own race, the making of acquaintance outside the tribal barrier being sternly discouraged by the authorities. Mrs. Samuel Sachs, indeed, had been heard more than once to observe pleasantly that she would sooner see her daughters lying dead before her than married to Christians. Netta tossed her head defiantly at these remarks, but contented herself with sowing her little crop of wild oats on the staircases of Bayswater and Maida Vale, where she sat out by the hour with the very indifferent specimens of Englishmen who frequented the dances in her set. Generally speaking, the race instincts of Rebecca of York are strong, and she is less apt to give her heart to Ivanhoe, the Saxon knight, than might be imagined. Bernard Sachs, a very smug-looking little boy with inordinately thick lips and a disagreeable nasal twang, had been placed between the 2 young Lunningers, who regarded him with a mixture of disgust and amusement, which they were at small pains to conceal. "Did you fast all day?" he said, by way of opening the conversation. "I did. I was bar mitzvah last month. Is either of you fellows bar mitzvah?" "I'm 13, if that's what you mean," said Lionel, with his most man-of-the-world air. He considered the introduction of the popular tribal phrases very bad form indeed. "I suppose you were in shul all day?" went on Bernard, unabashed and much on his dignity. "I was only in the synagogue in the morning," answered Lionel. Then he kicked Sidney violently under the table, and the two little brothers went off into a series of chuckles, while Bernard, with a vague sense of being insulted, turned his attention to his fried salmon and Dutch herring. Meanwhile Alec, who had been rather subdued at the beginning of the evening, was regaining his native confidence as the meal proceeded. He happened to be sitting opposite Bertie, and having elicited from his neighbour, Mrs. Quijano, the explanation of an alien presence among them on such an occasion, had fixed his attention with great frankness on the stranger. Very soon he was leaning across the table, and with much use of his fat red hands and many liftings of his round shoulders, was expatiating to the astonished Bertie on the beauties and advantages of the faith which he had just embraced. "Mr. Harrison," he cried at last. He preferred to skip the difficulties of the double-barrelled name. "Mr. Harrison, take my word for it, it is the finest religion under the sun. Those who have left it for reasons of their own have always come back in the end. They're bound to. They're bound to." He pronounced the word bound with an indescribable twang. "Look at Lord Beaconsfield." He pointed with his short forefinger. "Every one knows he died with a schma on his lips." There was a sudden stifled explosion of laughter from Leo's quarter of the table, and Judith glanced across rather anxiously at Reuben, on whose polite, impassive face she at once detected a look of annoyance. She was sitting next to her father in the close-fitting white gown which displayed to advantage the charming lines of her arms and shoulders. Now and then she caught the glance of Mr. Lee Harrison, who was far too well bred to obtrude his admiration by staring, fixed momentarily on her face. The hunger and weariness natural under the circumstances to her youth and health had in no way marred the perfect freshness of her appearance, and there was a gentle kindliness in her manner to her father which added a charm, not always present, to her beauty. Perhaps she felt instinctively, what Quijano himself was far too much in the clouds to notice, that no one made much account of him, that it behoved her to take him under her protection. He was one of this world's failures, and the Jewish people, so eager to crown success in any form, so determined in laying claim to the successful among their number, have scant love for those unfortunates who have dropped behind in the race. The meal came to an end at last, and there was a pushing back of chairs on the part of the men. Bertie, about to rise, felt himself held down by main force. Reuben was gripping him hard by the wrist with one hand, and with the other was engaging on fishing out his hat from under the table, while Netta, leaning across her cousin, explained with her most fascinating smile that grandpa was going to bench. Bertie, at a sign from Reuben, rose to the situation, and stooping for his own hat with alacrity, drew it from its place of concealment and placed it on his head. By this time all the men had unearthed and assumed their headgear, with the exception of Samuel Sachs, whose hat, by some mischance, was not forthcoming. However, to avoid delay, he covered his head in all gravity with his table napkin. Bertie glanced round him from one face to another, puzzled and inquiring. It seemed to him a solemn moment, this gathering together of kinsfolk after the long day of prayer, of expatiation, this offering up of thanksgiving, this performance of the ancient rites in the land of exile. He could not understand the spirit of indifference, of levity even, which appeared to prevail. A finer historic sense, other motives apart, should, it seemed, have prevented so obvious a display of the contempt which familiarity had bred. Alec had put his hat on rakishly askew, and was winking across to him reassuringly, as though to intimate that the whole thing was not to be taken seriously. Rose, led on by Jack Quijano, giggled hysterically behind her pocket-handkerchief. Leo and Esther took on airs of aggressive boredom. Judith, lifting her eyes, met Reuben's in a smile, and even Montague Cohen permitted himself to yawn. Only old Solomon at the head of the table, mumbling and droning out the long grace in his corrupt Hebrew, his great face impenetrably grave, appeared to take any interest in the proceeding, with perhaps the exception of his son Samuel, who joined in now and then from beneath the drooping shelter of his table napkin. Bertie stared, and Bertie wondered. Needless to state, he was completely out of touch with these people whose faith his search for the true religion had led him, for the time being, to embrace. Grace over, the women went upstairs, the men, with the exception of old Solomon, remaining behind to smoke. Bertie, who was thoroughly tired out, soon rose to go. "I will make your excuses upstairs," said Reuben. But the polite little man preferred to go to the drawing-room and perform his farewells in person. "Thanks so much," he said in the hall where Leo and Reuben were speeding him. "I hope you've been edified, that's all." Reuben laughed. "I'm deeply interested in the Jewish character," answered Bertie. "The strongly marked contrasts, the underlying resemblances, the elaborate differentiations from a fundamental type." "Oh, yes," broke in Reuben, secretly irritated, his tribal sensitivities a little hurt. "You will find among us all sorts and conditions of men, except perhaps Don Quixote or even King Cophetua," added Leo. "King Cophetua," repeated Reuben in a slow, reflective tone, as the door closed on Mr. Lee Harrison. "King Cophetua had an assured position. It isn't every one that can afford to marry beggar maids." Chapter 8